In 1849, Kansas was a land caught between promise and peril, a place where the open plains seemed to stretch forever and the horizon felt like an invitation to a better life. Families packed up everything they owned and headed west, chasing the dream of starting over, of finding freedom from the crowded cities and their suffocating problems. The air itself seemed to whisper opportunity, but it also carried the weight of uncertainty, because life on the frontier was not for the faint of heart. People came with hope burning in their chest, but that hope was fragile, because every step they took into that untamed land carried the risk of hunger, disease, or danger from strangers who didn't always mean well. Small settlements started to dot the trails, each one becoming a lifeline for weary travelers who had spent weeks on wagons or horseback, fighting exhaustion and the harsh elements. These settlements weren't just places to buy food or rest for the night, they were the beating heart of survival on the frontier. A single inn or trading post could mean the difference between life and death, and that meant that strangers had to trust each other, even when trust felt like a gamble. People were forced to take kindness at face value, to put their faith in whoever offered them a meal or a bed, because there was no choice but to believe that someone's outstretched hand wouldn't lead them to harm. The Kansas landscape was both beautiful and haunting, with tall grass swaying in the wind and long shadows that stretched far across the earth when the sun began to fall. Travelers would look out and see nothing but sky and field, feeling both freedom and isolation in the same breath. It was easy to believe that no harm could come to you out there, that the openness itself was a kind of protection. But that illusion could shatter in an instant, because when something went wrong, when danger came, there was no one to hear you scream, no neighbors to run to, no safety net waiting to catch you. Every new family that built a cabin, every store that opened its doors, became part of this fragile ecosystem of trust and survival. And in 1849, when word spread of a new settlement near the Osage Trail, it drew people like a flame draws moths. Farmers, traders, and lonely wanderers passed through, grateful to see signs of life after miles of endless prairie. To them, a place to sit down, share a meal, and hear another human voice was more than comfort. It was salvation. Travelers would exchange news of the road, swap warnings about storms or bandits, and sometimes, if they were lucky, find a moment of joy before moving on to face the wilderness again. The atmosphere of those early years was one of cautious optimism, a feeling that life was hard but possible if everyone played their part. Strangers relied on strangers, believing that survival was a shared responsibility and that mutual trust kept the darkness at bay. But under that surface of goodwill, there was always the lingering thought that one wrong choice, one wrong place to stop, could mean everything falling apart. It was this mixture of faith and fear that defined the frontier spirit, pushing people to take chances but always watching their backs. And it was in this backdrop, this raw and vulnerable Kansas settlement, that a story began to take shape, a story that would twist that trust into something dark, a story that would remind everyone that danger doesn't always roar in with warning. Sometimes it smiles, welcomes you in, and waits until you are too tired, too hungry, and too hopeful to see what's coming next. When the Bender family arrived in this fragile settlement, they carried with them an air of mystery that both intrigued and unsettled those who met them. They were not like the other families who came with cheerful greetings and stories of the roads they had traveled. They were quieter, more watchful, as though they were always holding something back. The father, often called Pa Bender, was a large man with a heavy presence, someone who spoke little but seemed to watch everything with sharp, calculating eyes. His wife was equally reserved, keeping mostly to herself, her face lined and unreadable, giving the impression that she measured everyone before deciding whether they were worth speaking to. The son, John, was a strange figure in the settlement, his smile just a little too wide, his laugh at odd times making others uneasy, as though he found humor where no one else could see it. But it was Kate Bender who drew the most attention, and not just because she was younger and striking in appearance. Kate had a way of speaking that held people, a charm that felt almost magnetic, and soon rumors began to spread that she possessed more than just a clever tongue. She called herself a spiritualist, claiming she could speak with the dead, and in those days when loss was an everyday companion and graves were freshly dug all along the frontier, such a gift was not only respected, but sought out. Travelers who passed by were curious to meet her, to sit across from her in the small cabin where the Benders lived and listen as she spoke of the spirits that lingered around them. Some swore she told them things no stranger could possibly know, details about loved ones they had buried back east, words that brought comfort or warnings that chilled them to the bone. This reputation quickly spread, turning the Bender home into a place that promised answers to those desperate enough to seek them. But there was also a subtle unease that seemed to follow every encounter, as though Kate's eyes held something too knowing, her smile lingering a moment too long, making even the faithful hesitate before crossing the threshold. The Benders were clever, presenting themselves as both useful and needed in a community where every new service was welcomed. They built a small inn and offered meals to travelers, something no one could refuse when the nearest alternative might be miles away. The cabin was simple, with a single room divided by a canvas sheet, one side for the family's living space and the other for guests to eat and rest. People said the Benders kept it tidy, welcoming even, with a table always set and a fire burning to warm those who stopped in. It became an easy place to recommend to strangers heading west, because on the surface it seemed like a refuge from the lonely, dangerous road. But there was something about the family that made some of the locals keep their distance, an instinct that hummed beneath the surface like a warning bell. There were whispers that arguments could be heard from the cabin late at night, voices raised in a language no one could quite place, and sometimes strange noises that made the hair on the back of the neck stand up. Those who stayed for a meal often spoke of a strange tension in the air, as though the family watched their guests too closely, waiting for something no one could name. Still, the flow of travelers never stopped, and the Benders remained an enigma, neither fully trusted nor fully shunned, existing in that thin space where curiosity outweighs fear. To the weary, their home was a beacon of rest and spiritual guidance, a chance to feel seen and heard in a land that could be brutally indifferent to suffering. But to those who paid attention, the Benders were something else entirely, a riddle wrapped in politeness and faint smiles, leaving behind an unsettled feeling that would only make sense when the true purpose of their arrival was finally uncovered. Kate Bender quickly became the face of the family, the one who smiled easily, who welcomed travelers with a warmth that put them at ease after long, weary days on the road. She spoke in a soft, hypnotic tone that seemed to calm the restless, and she always seemed to know exactly what someone wanted to hear. She called herself a spiritualist, a psychic, someone gifted with the ability to connect with the unseen world, and for people in those days, that was no small promise. Death was everywhere on the frontier, children taken by fever, wives lost in childbirth, husbands killed in accidents or by the elements, and grief had nowhere to go but inward. Kate gave that grief somewhere to land, offering messages from the dead, assurances that loved ones were at peace, and warnings about dangers that might still lie ahead. Her sessions were said to be almost theatrical, the single-room cabin transformed by lamplight and Kate's steady voice into a place where the ordinary world seemed to slip away. She would sit her guests down at the table, her eyes never leaving theirs, and speak as though she were listening to someone just behind their shoulder. Some travelers claimed she brought them comfort that felt so real it brought them to tears. Others left shaken, as though she had touched on something they wished had stayed buried. It didn't take long for word to spread beyond the small settlement, and soon people traveling the Osage Trail made it a point to stop at the Bender cabin, curious to meet the girl who could speak to the spirits. But there was a darker edge to Kate's reputation, one that made her all the more fascinating. She wasn't just a healer or a medium, she claimed to have power over her own destiny, preaching about free love and independence, ideas that scandalized some of the more conservative settlers. She spoke boldly about women's rights and the power of desire, about living without shame, and this, combined with her psychic gifts, made her feel both dangerous and magnetic. People were drawn to her not only because she could speak to the dead, but because she seemed to promise a way to live differently, to break free from the rigid expectations of the time. The men who passed through often seemed particularly captivated, spending more time at the cabin than they had planned, lingering over meals, listening to Kate talk long after the fire had burned low. She had a way of making each guest feel like the center of her attention, as if she saw them in a way no one else ever had. And yet, there were those who left with a strange heaviness, an unsettled feeling they couldn't shake, as though Kate had seen too much, told them too much, left them somehow exposed. The locals noticed how frequently lone travelers seemed to be the ones drawn most strongly to her sessions, and how often those were the ones who never made it to their next destination. The combination of Kate's beauty, her confidence, and her claims of supernatural insight created a perfect storm, one that made her cabin a magnet for the vulnerable. People who had lost everything, who had no one waiting for them at the end of the road, found themselves opening up to her, telling her their secrets, their fears, even their plans for the future. And Kate listened, nodding, smiling, perhaps already calculating who might be worth more than the price of a simple meal. The Benders had built a business around offering food and lodging, but Kate had built something far more powerful, a reputation that made people come willingly, sit down willingly, and trust willingly, without ever suspecting that they were stepping into a place where trust could cost them their life. Each night that passed, each stranger who stopped to rest, made the Bender cabin feel more and more like a crossroads, a place where fate could change in an instant. Kate's voice would carry through the night, a soft, soothing sound that lulled her guests into a false sense of safety, while somewhere behind the canvas partition, the rest of the family waited, silent and watchful. The visitors came looking for guidance, for meaning, and Kate gave it to them freely, but what she took in return would only be understood when it was too late to escape. The cabin that the Benders called home was unlike most others along the trail, not because it was larger or grander, but because it carried a certain strangeness in its design that travelers would remember long after they left. It was a single-room structure, simple at first glance, but divided down the middle by a heavy canvas sheet that stretched from one wall to the other, cutting the space into two distinct halves. On one side, there was the table where meals were served, a fire that was always burning to welcome guests, and benches where weary travelers could rest. On the other side of the canvas was the family's living space, unseen by the visitors, hidden just out of sight. This partition created an atmosphere that was both intimate and unnerving, as though the family were present even when you couldn't see them, listening to every word, every sound. The table was always placed in a curious position, with one end near the canvas, leaving little room between where a guest might sit and the hanging sheet behind them. People didn't think much of it at first, assuming it was simply the most practical way to arrange such a small space, but the placement would later become one of the most chilling details of the entire story. The room smelled of food and wood smoke, the kind of scents that made travelers feel safe, that reminded them of home even if home was far away. It was warm inside, welcoming after the cold wind of the Kansas prairie, and the Benders made sure to offer their guests a hot meal as soon as they arrived, their hospitality almost too perfect, too rehearsed, as though every action had been practiced many times before. The canvas partition had a way of playing tricks on the mind, the faintest movement behind it catching a traveler's eye, the sound of footsteps muffled but present. Some swore they could hear whispering just beyond it, low voices speaking in a language they didn't understand, stopping suddenly when they turned their head. The family would smile when asked about it, dismissing the sounds as nothing, assuring their guests that all was well. But the feeling of being watched never quite left, as though the cabin itself was paying close attention to every person who crossed its threshold. The Benders used this setting to their advantage, Kate sitting with her guests and holding their attention completely while the rest of the family moved behind the canvas, silent and unseen. Travelers felt comfortable there, perhaps even vulnerable, as though the warmth and conversation loosened the weight they carried on the road. They would eat, drink and talk freely, never realizing that every word was being heard by more than just the young woman across from them. The positioning of the table meant that a guest's back was always toward the partition, a small detail that seemed unimportant until one imagines what might happen on the other side of that canvas when no one was looking. Locals who visited the cabin would sometimes mention how eerily quiet it could become, the entire family seeming to go still at once, their smiles fixed, but their eyes unreadable. There was a heaviness to the room in those moments, as though something hung in the air waiting to fall. And yet, the Benders kept attracting new faces, their home becoming a regular stop along the trail, the table always ready for the next weary soul in need of rest. The combination of warmth, food, and the promise of Kate's visions made the place almost irresistible, turning what should have been just another cabin into a landmark on the prairie. It was this very arrangement, the fire, the table, the canvas, and the hidden movements behind it, that would later reveal itself to be more than just a simple quirk of frontier life. It was a stage carefully set, designed to make travelers comfortable enough to let their guard down, to put themselves exactly where the Benders wanted them. The canvas was more than a divider. It was a veil between safety and danger, a thin barrier separating those who still had a chance to leave from those who had already unknowingly crossed the point of no return. The disappearances began slowly, almost too quietly to notice at first, just a traveler here and there who failed to reach the next settlement down the trail. In those days, this was not unusual, because the road west was full of dangers. Wagons broke down, storms stranded entire families, and sometimes people simply vanished without explanation. But as the months passed, whispers began to spread among the settlers and traders that too many were going missing near the same stretch of road, that the last place they had been seen was often near the Bender property. Some shrugged it off as coincidence. Others felt a chill crawl up their spine as they realized just how many names were being added to the list of the missing. Families traveling west would sometimes stop and ask if anyone had seen their loved ones, describing fathers, brothers, or sons who had set out ahead of them, but had never sent word. The locals had few answers to give, only a growing unease that made them watch the trail with suspicion. There were stories of wagons abandoned miles from town, belongings still inside as though their owners had stepped away for only a moment and never returned. And still, travelers kept stopping at the Bender Inn, unaware that their journey might end there, their absence to be explained away by bad luck or the unforgiving prairie. The tension in the settlement grew as the pattern became harder to ignore, and neighbors began to quietly warn each other to be careful about where they stayed. Some chose to ride past the Bender cabin without stopping, uneasy about the strange feeling that seemed to hang in the air around it. Others, desperate for rest, took the chance and went in, hoping the stories were nothing more than wild rumors. Those who came back told of how strangely quiet the place could be at night, how the family's eyes seemed to follow them too closely, how Kate's gaze made them feel both comforted and strangely trapped. When one prominent traveler went missing, a man who was expected to return to his family and had business waiting for him, the community could no longer turn away from the growing suspicion. Search parties were organized. Neighbors walked the trails, calling out names, looking for any sign of where these people might have gone. The prairie gave back little, just trampled grass or the faint impression of wagon tracks that disappeared into nothing. The Benders, as always, remained calm and polite, offering no clue that they might know more than they admitted, their smiles as fixed and warm as ever. Yet the sense of dread continued to grow, and with it came anger, because these were not just strangers going missing. They were husbands, brothers, sons, men who had shaken hands with the same neighbors who now searched for them. Each disappearance was a wound, and every new name added to the list deepened the sense that something was terribly wrong. Travelers started carrying weapons more openly, staying in groups when possible, and moving quickly past places that felt unsafe. The road that had once felt full of promise now carried an undercurrent of fear, as though death waited just out of sight. The Bender cabin stood quietly through it all, the canvas still hanging, the table still set, the fire still glowing in welcome. It was the perfect picture of hospitality, and that was what made it all the more terrifying. Because the more people vanished, the more the place seemed to hum with dark possibility, as if those who entered were stepping into a story that had already been written for them, one where the ending was always the same and no one would ever know until it was too late. The truth came to light in the most horrifying way, beginning with the discovery of a hidden trapdoor beneath the floorboards of the Bender cabin. Searchers had arrived after yet another traveler vanished, this time a man whose disappearance could not be ignored, and suspicion finally turned toward the family who had been so careful to keep themselves apart from everyone else. When the cabin was searched, the table was overturned, the canvas ripped down, and the floor carefully examined until someone found the small door, cleverly concealed, leading down into a dark, narrow cellar. The smell that rose up was foul, thick with the unmistakable stench of death, and it was then that everyone knew something unspeakable had been happening behind the walls of that little house on the prairie. When they descended into the darkness, they found the dirt floor soaked with blood, the ground stained from what must have been many bodies over a long stretch of time. The cellar was not large, barely enough room for a few men to stand hunched inside, and yet it felt oppressive, the air heavy with the weight of what had taken place there. It was clear that this was not an accident, not some tragic misfortune. This was a place where death had been planned, carried out, and repeated. The partitioned room above suddenly made a terrible kind of sense. The table positioned just so, The victim's back always turned to the canvas where someone could wait unseen. The entire cabin revealed itself to be less a home and more a carefully arranged stage for murder. The searchers did not stop with the cellar. They turned to the orchard outside, the neat rows of trees that had seemed so peaceful and well cared for, and began to dig. What they unearthed turned the settlement into a place of nightmares. Shallow graves, one after another, each containing the remains of travelers who had never made it to their destinations. Men, women, even children, their bodies showing signs of blunt force trauma to the head, some with their throats cut, all buried in haste as though the killers knew there would always be another victim to take the place of the last. Each grave was another confirmation that what had been feared was true, that the disappearances were not random at all, but the work of human hands guided by something far darker than necessity. The sheer number of bodies shocked even the most hardened men in the settlement. The orchard became a graveyard of secrets, and as more were uncovered, the mood turned from disbelief to fury. The settlers could no longer pretend that evil was something distant, something that lived far away. It had been right there among them, smiling, feeding them, offering them shelter while slaughtering those who trusted them. The Bender family had not merely taken lives, they had betrayed the fragile bond that held frontier communities together, the unspoken agreement that everyone must look out for one another in order to survive. And yet, as the searchers uncovered more evidence, one detail sent a chill through everyone who gathered to watch. The cabin was empty. The Bender family was gone, vanished without a trace, leaving behind the scene of their crimes, but escaping the justice that everyone now demanded. There were no signs of a struggle, no evidence of where they had gone, as though they had simply melted into the prairie. The thought that they might still be out there, somewhere, ready to start again, kept the settlers awake at night, clutching their weapons and staring into the dark. The cabin was left in ruins, torn apart by those who had once nodded politely to the family, their rage driving them to smash the table, rip down the canvas, and burn what they could not carry away. The little house that had once been a beacon of rest became a place no one wanted to stand near, the soil around it marked forever by what had been done. Even the orchard, stripped of its harvest and scarred by graves, seemed to take on a cursed air, the wind whispering through its branches like the voices of the dead calling out for someone to remember them. The disappearance of the Bender family only deepened the horror, turning fear into something closer to obsession as the settlers and lawmen tried to track them down. Posses were formed almost immediately, riders scouring the countryside in every direction, following any sign that might point to where the killers had gone. There were reports of wagon tracks leading away from the property, but they soon vanished into the open prairie where wind and weather erased them within days. Each clue seemed to fade as quickly as it appeared, as though the family had planned their escape with the same care they had planned their murders. The settlers were left with nothing but anger, their hands empty, their thirst for justice unanswered, the knowledge of what had happened gnawing at them like a wound that refused to heal. Stories began to spread, each one adding to the growing legend of the Benders. Some claimed they had been seen heading north, others swore they had been spotted in Texas or even as far west as New Mexico, changing their names and blending in with other travelers. There were reports of arrests made in distant towns, couples and families brought in on suspicion of being the Benders, but none could ever be proven beyond doubt. Every time someone thought they had caught them, the truth slipped through like smoke, leaving behind only more questions and a fresh wave of fear. People began to wonder if the Benders had split up, each going their own way, which made the idea of finding them even more terrifying, because it meant the danger was scattered, impossible to contain. For years after the discovery, the name Bender became a shadow that hung over Kansas. Parents warned their children about strangers on the road, travelers kept their rifles closer, and even the bravest men admitted to feeling a chill when they passed by the place where the cabin had once stood. It wasn't just the murders that haunted them, it was the fact that the killers were still free, that justice had never been served, and that anyone, anywhere, might open their door one night to find a familiar smile and a hand extended in false kindness. The Benders became more than a family. They became a story told by firelight, a way of explaining that evil can wear the face of a neighbor and that trust can turn to betrayal in the space of a single meal. Some settlers refused to believe the family could truly escape, insisting that vigilantes must have caught them in the wilderness and delivered their own kind of justice far from the eyes of the law. There were rumors of shallow graves found in lonely stretches of prairie, of bones unearthed years later that might have belonged to them, though no one could ever say for certain. Others believed the Benders were still alive, moving from place to place, starting over whenever suspicion grew too close, leaving behind more victims who were never connected to their name. The uncertainty was its own kind of torment, making the story grow darker with each passing year. The legend of Kate Bender became the most chilling of all. Her image burned into the minds of those who had seen her smile, her voice still echoing in the memories of those who had once sat at her table. Some swore she was a witch, that her psychic claims had been real all along, that she had used some unholy power to stay one step ahead of those who hunted her. Others said she had changed her face, disguised herself, married some unsuspecting man, and was living quietly somewhere, waiting for the moment she would strike again. Her name became a warning, a ghost that haunted campfire conversations, a reminder that not every monster wears claws or fangs. As the years passed, the prairie swallowed what remained of the Bender homestead, the earth reclaiming the space where the cabin had once stood, but the fear never truly faded. Travelers still spoke in hushed voices when they approached that stretch of road, and even those who didn't believe in spirits admitted that the place felt wrong, as though the ground itself remembered. The Benders had vanished into the vastness of America, but their story stayed behind, a scar that reminded everyone who heard it that trust on the open road could be as dangerous as any storm, and that sometimes the real danger was not what waited outside, but who smiled at you from across the table. The legacy of Kate Bender and her family became more than just a chapter in frontier history. It became a cautionary tale that generations passed down like a dark inheritance. Long after the cabin had been burned to the ground and the orchard left to rot, people still spoke of the Benders in whispers, as though saying their names too loudly might call them back. Travelers told the story to each other on lonely stretches of road, their voices low as the fire crackled, their eyes scanning the darkness as though half expecting a smiling young woman to step out from the shadows. The story became a way to explain the unexplainable, a way to remind people that evil can grow in the most ordinary of places, waiting patiently until it is ready to strike. Kate herself became almost mythical in the retelling, a figure both feared and strangely fascinating, a woman who dared to be bold in a world that demanded women remain silent, and who twisted that boldness into something unspeakably cruel. She was remembered not just as a murderer, but as a seductress, a manipulator who used charm as easily as others used a knife, luring people in with promises of comfort and answers before taking their lives. Her name carried a strange power, inspiring both terror and a morbid kind of admiration, as though people couldn't quite look away from the nightmare she represented. In towns across Kansas, her story was told not just as history, but as a warning, a way to keep travelers cautious, to remind them that not every friendly face was a safe one. The murders at the Bender property also forced people to face a darker truth about the frontier they had chosen to settle. It was supposed to be a land of opportunity, a place where good, hard-working people could build a better future, but the story of the Benders proved that it was also a place where lawlessness could thrive. With towns so far apart and justice so slow to arrive, those who meant harm could operate in the shadows, preying on the lonely, the lost, and the hopeful. The Benders became a symbol of that hidden danger, a reminder that the wilderness was not the only threat. Sometimes the real danger was human, living behind a door you might knock on seeking shelter. The psychological weight of the murders lingered long after the last grave was dug, leaving a mark on the community that would never fully fade. Families who had lost loved ones were left without closure, haunted by the thought of their final moments at that cabin table, by the knowledge that their trust had been betrayed in the cruelest possible way. For those who survived that era, the road past the orchard became a place of quiet dread, a spot where travelers would hurry their horses, as though speed could outrun the memory of what had happened there. Even when the prairie began to bloom again, even when new settlers came and built fresh homes nearby, the ground felt stained, the air heavier than it should have been. Folklorists, writers, and storytellers carried the tale far beyond Kansas, turning it into one of America's earliest true crime legends. It appeared in newspapers, in dime novels, in local histories, each retelling adding another layer of darkness, another detail to make listeners shiver. Some swore they had seen Kate's ghost wandering the prairie, her dress trailing behind her, her face lit by some unearthly glow as she searched for her next victim. Others claimed the spirits of the murdered still lingered near the orchard, their restless energy refusing to let the land grow quiet again. Whether or not the supernatural played any part in it, the story had taken root, and it was never going to be forgotten. Even now, more than a century later, the name Bender is enough to make historians and ghost hunters alike lean closer, drawn by the mystery of what really happened to the family and why they were never caught. Some believe the legend has grown so large because it touches on something primal, a fear of betrayal, a fear of sitting across the table from someone who means you harm and not realizing it until it is far too late. The story endures because it is not just about the past, it is about the present, a reminder that danger often comes wearing a smile, and that trust, once broken, leaves a shadow that can never be fully erased.